Diala, what are you doing?
She had 2 seconds to stop a murder, so she kissed the man who never saw her. Diala Martin had been invisible for 3 years, serving champagne to billionaires who didn't know her name, until she saw the gun's reflection in the chandelier, aimed at the CEO. Shoot her on the balcony. She ran, grabbed Chandler McFarland, and kissed him while cameras captured everything live. The scandal destroyed the company in 48 hours. He blamed her, fired her. You ruined everything. But when she returned to the board meeting, she wasn't alone, and she was no longer an employee. 30% of the shares, heiress, and I have proof of who really orchestrated the assassination attempt. Chandler froze. Diala, how long have you known? The question is, was the kiss just to save him? Or was it part of something much bigger?
Hi, I'm Kay, the author of this channel, and today I came to thank Lisa and Pam for their feedback. Thank you so much for the compliments, and even for the criticism some of you leave, everyone. I'm always working to tell better stories. And before we actually start the story, tell me, do you believe a simple kiss can save a life?
Chapter 1. The Reflection and the Kiss.
I better do this now. He dies in 2 seconds.
The main hall of McFarland Industries gleamed with the intensity of 1,000 stars trapped in crystal, and Diala Martin moved between tables with the silent precision of someone who had learned to be invisible. 3 years doing this, 3 years serving champagne to people who never looked at her face, only at the silver tray she carried with steady hands. She had already accepted her role in that world of luxury and power, but acceptance didn't mean it didn't hurt a little. Every time someone reached out without even noticing she was human. The annual party was the event of the year. 200 VIPs scattered throughout the monumental space that looked more like a European palace transplanted to Manhattan, and the discreet black uniform she wore made her part of the decor. Just another functional detail among Swarovski chandeliers and white rose, arrangements that cost more than her monthly salary. Diala knew every inch of that hall, every shadow, every reflection, because going unnoticed required her to know the setting better than the protagonists themselves. Chandler McFarland was near the central stage, imposing in his dark grey Tom Ford suit, and even from a distance it was impossible not to feel the gravity he exerted over the environment. Investors surrounded him like planets orbiting the sun, all eager for a second of his attention, for a word that could mean millions. And he distributed calculated smiles with the same precision a surgeon would manipulate a scalpel. Diala approached table 7 to collect empty glasses, moving with the automatic fluidity of someone who had repeated that gesture 1,000 times. But something made her pause for a fraction of a second. The chandelier above her head reflected light strangely, creating patterns that shouldn't be there, and she raised her eyes following the instinct she had learned to trust all. These years watching without being seen. The reflection in the crystal showed the east balcony, and what Diala saw made her heart stop completely for a second that seemed to stretch into eternity. A dark silhouette, something elongated in its hands, the unmistakable angle of a gun, aimed directly at where Chandler was about to step onto the stage for his annual speech. Time slowed in a way she had only experienced in nightmares, that kind of mental slowness, where each thought crystallized with brutal clarity, and options presented themselves as illuminated paths that all led to the same terrible destination. Scream? The music was too loud. No one would hear in time, and even if they did, the resulting chaos could accelerate the shot instead of preventing it. Security? They were scattered around the perimeter, too far to intercept something that would happen in seconds, maybe less. 2 options evaporated before they even fully formed, and Diala was left with only one insane, impossible, absurd idea, but one that shone in her mind with the force of an unshakable certainty. Cameras. There were at least 15 press crews filming every second of that party, lenses pointed at Chandler, waiting for the moment when he would step onto the stage, and no shooter would be crazy enough to fire with so many visual witnesses, capturing everything live. The tray slipped from her hands, and the sound of glass shattering against marble cut through the music like a blade, and Diala was running before she even consciously processed the decision. High heels, black uniform, hair escaping from her tight bun. She crossed the hall in a straight line while 200 heads turned to see her break 3 years of invisibility in 10 explosive seconds. Chandler turned his face when she was 3 meters away, confusion painted on aristocratic features that rarely showed any emotion that wasn't calculated, and his mouth opened to form a question that never came out. Diella didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, didn't think about the consequences. She just grabbed his face with both hands and pulled hard enough to make him bend slightly toward her. The kiss was explosion and salvation at the same time. It was lips meeting with desperate urgency, while camera flashes detonated around them like fireworks capturing the impossible. The first second was pure shock, her feeling the texture of his lips and vaguely processing that she was kissing Chandler McFarland in front of 200 people, and God knew how many millions, watching the live broadcast. The second was when their hearts synchronized, and Diella felt his pulse racing against her chest pressed to his, beating in the same frantic rhythm as hers, as if their bodies had recognized something their minds were still struggling to accept. The third second was when he stopped resisting and started responding, and his large hand found her waist with firm, instinctive, possessive pressure in a way that made something break and rebuild. Simultaneously inside her, the music stopped completely, replaced by a shocked silence that quickly filled with scandalized murmurs and the mechanical sound of dozens of cameras capturing every angle of that impossible moment. Diella pulled away, breathless, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second that was enough to see confusion, desire, and something dangerously close to recognition burning in that gray gaze she only knew from afar. Her voice came out broken, hoarse, loaded with adrenaline and horror at what she had just done. Sorry, I need to... She didn't finish the sentence, just spun on her heels and ran, crossing the hall in the opposite direction while hot tears began to burn her eyes. The industrial kitchen was a labyrinth of stainless steel and steam that she knew by heart, and Diella moved on autopilot until she found the back door, pushing the emergency bar hard enough to make the silent alarm flash soundlessly. The cold New York night air hit her like a slap, but she kept running, heels clicking on the wet asphalt, while her brain finally began to process the magnitude of what she had done. Inside the hall, chaos set in, with the force of a Category 5 hurricane, and Phoebe Fitzgerald's voice cut through the stunned silence like an ice blade. What was that? Her red Versace dress seemed to vibrate with the fury contained in every syllable, and all eyes turned to Chandler as if they expected him to have a rational explanation for the inexplicable. Chandler was still standing in the same spot, fingers unconsciously touching his own lips, and the expression on his face was of someone who had just been struck by lightning and wasn't sure if he had survived or not. I don't know. The words came out slow, processed with difficulty, and he sounded genuinely lost for the first time in years. The head of security came running from the direction of the east balcony, face red from exertion and alarm, and his voice thundered through the sound system when he grabbed the nearest microphone. Gun! We found an abandoned gun on the east balcony. The instantaneous panic that swept through the hall was almost palpable. Muffled screams and nervous movement as additional security materialized from every corner. The realization hit Chandler with the force of a punch to the stomach, stealing the air from his lungs and making his legs imperceptibly weaken. She saved me. The words echoed in his mind with crystal clarity, immediately followed by the question that wouldn't be silenced. How did she know? How had an invisible employee he barely registered existed seen something his entire military security team had missed? The next 2 hours were a blur of flashing lights, questions shouted by reporters who had smelled blood in the water, and Chandler watched passively as headlines began appearing in real time on cell phone screens around him. Employee kisses CEO at gala, scandal or publicity stunt, McFarland's mystery, woman who is she, McFarland Gate trending worldwide. Phoebe dragged him to a private corner away from the cameras, perfectly manicured nails digging into his arm hard enough to leave marks he would feel tomorrow. Fire her now. It wasn't a request, it was an order. It was an ultimatum delivered with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Chandler turned to face her fully for the first time since the kiss, and something in his eyes made Phoebe instinctively step back half a pace, recognizing the danger pulsing there. No. The word came out low, controlled, but loaded with an unshakable certainty that admitted no discussion. Chandler, be reasonable, Phoebe began, but he interrupted her with an abrupt hand gesture that cut the air between them, like a final sentence. She saved my life, Phoebe, and now protecting her is my responsibility. The words came out with a weight that made all the air around them seem denser. Loaded with implications, neither of them was ready to examine closely. Outside, running through the deserted Manhattan streets at 3 in the morning, Diala finally stopped to breathe, leaning against a freezing brick wall while sobs shook her entire body. She had saved his life, that was true, but in doing so, she had destroyed her own life with the same brutal efficiency. And now there was no going back, no way to undo that kiss that still burned on her lips like a permanent mark. The phone in her uniform pocket vibrated insistently, and when she finally pulled it out with trembling hands, the screen showed 47 unread messages and 23 missed calls, and Diala didn't need to open any of them to know that her life as she knew it had ended the second her lips touched his. On the abandoned balcony, the hastily discarded gun was still warm when forensics found it, fingerprints carefully wiped clean. But the security camera from the building next door had captured a silhouette. Fleeing, and in the coming hours that silhouette would be identified, tracked, and would lead to a web of conspiracy none of them could yet imagine. But in that moment, all that mattered was the taste of him still lingering in her mouth, the sensation of his hand on her waist, burning through the thin fabric of her uniform, and the terrible and wonderful certainty that nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 2. Consequences and Flashbacks.
Either you went insane, or you just saved my life.
The elevator rose with torturous slowness, and Diala watched the digital numbers change with the same morbid fascination of someone watching their own execution approach. Floor 35, 36, 37. Each digit taking her closer to Chandler McFarlane's office in the building's penthouse, and her heart was beating so loud she was sure anyone in the elevator would hear it if she weren't completely alone in that box of steel and mirrors. The summons had arrived by email at 7 in the morning, formal and cold, like everything that came from the executive department, but personally signed by him, and that was enough to make her stomach churn with a toxic mixture of anxiety and something dangerously close to anticipation. I'm going to be fired, sued. Both. The thought hammered in her mind with the insistence of a dark mantra, while her hands sweated inside the black gloves she had worn to hide the high. Trembling, Floor 40 arrived with a soft electronic sound, and the doors opened, revealing a hallway of Italian marble. The executive secretary didn't even look up when Diala passed, just vaguely waved toward the double mahogany doors at the end of the corridor. And that disdainful gesture burned more than any direct insult could. Chandler had his back turned when she entered, a dark silhouette cut out against the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan bathed in golden morning light. He didn't turn when he heard the door close, didn't speak for long seconds that stretched like elastic about to snap, and Diala stood near the entrance, not knowing if she should advance or wait for permission. Either you went insane, his voice finally cut through the silence, deep and controlled in a way that made each word sound like judgment, or you saved my life. He still hadn't turned, and Diala found herself speaking to his back, to the tense shoulders under the gray suit that was probably different from yesterday's but looked identical in its impeccable perfection. I saw the reflection in the chandelier, gun, east balcony. 2 seconds to act. The words came out firm despite the tremor running through her entire body, and she forced her hands to stay still along her body, even when every instinct screamed to cross her arms in protection. There wasn't time for anything else. Chandler finally turned, and the impact of those gray eyes fixed on her with laser intensity almost made her step back. He studied her like she was an impossible puzzle, something that defied all the logic he had spent his entire life mastering, and the way his jaw tightened indicated he didn't like not understanding. "And you chose to kiss me?" The question carried layers she wasn't ready to unwrap. The memory hit her without warning, pulling her 6 months back with the force of a current that couldn't be resisted. The office was dark except for the blue light from the computer, and Diala had entered to empty the trash cans from the extra shift she had taken to cover the dentist bill. Chandler was collapsed on the desk unconscious, and the panic that went through her was so visceral that she dropped the garbage bag and ran to him before thinking, "Mr. McFarland?" Her hands trembled when she touched his shoulder, shaking gently, and the relief she felt when he groaned low was so intense it almost made her cry. 72 hours without sleep, according to the secretary who had commented in the hallway. 72 hours locked in there, negotiating the merger that would save 200 jobs, and apparently his body had collected the price. The ambulance arrived in 12 minutes, And Diella went along because someone needed to go, and there was no one else in the building at that hour of the morning. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and silent despair, and she stayed in the waiting room holding his jacket that she had grabbed from, the chair fingers tracing the expensive fabric, while nurses went in and out with professional expressions that revealed nothing. He woke up 3 hours later, and the first thing he saw when he opened his eyes was Diella sitting in the chair next to the bed, head tilted in uncomfortable sleep, but still there, still present. "You stayed?" His voice came out hoarse from disuse and something that could be surprise or confusion, or maybe both things mixed. Someone had to stay. Diella straightened too quickly, making her spine protest after hours in the wrong position. But she didn't care about the pain, because he was awake and well, and that was all that mattered in that moment. There was a second where the world seemed to suspend, where his eyes studied her with an intensity that made something melt and harden, simultaneously inside her, and then he leaned slightly toward her, and Diella realized with stunned shock that he was going to kiss her. It almost happened, almost. But then he pulled back abruptly, as if he had been burned, and the expression that replaced the desire was something close to horror. "You work for me. You can't—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to, because they both knew exactly what couldn't happen between a billionaire CEO and a cleaning employee who earned minimum wage. "I know." Diella's words came out small, wounded, but she got up and left before he could see the tears burning her eyes. The present reasserted itself with brutal force, and Diella realized she had been silent too long because Chandler had gotten closer while she was lost in the memory. "It was the first thing I thought of. Camera's public kiss. Impossible for the shooter to fire with the media filming everything live." The explanation was logical, perfect, made complete sense, but her voice betrayed that there were layers she wasn't admitting. Chandler took another step, invading her personal space in a way that made the air between them dense and charged with palpable electricity. Was that all? The question was low, dangerous, and carried the weight of everything that hadn't been said between them in recent months. All the times they had crossed paths in hallways and pretended not to feel the current that connected them. 4 months ago, the corporate kitchen was silent and empty, and Diella was heating lunch leftovers in the microwave because she had slept in. The office again, and needed something in her stomach before the morning shift started. The door opened and Chandler entered, clearly surprised to find someone there at 11 at night, and they stood looking at each other for long seconds before he broke the silence. "You're always here." It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation loaded with something Diella couldn't fully decipher. "Someone needs to be." She tried to sound casual, but his presence made her nervous in a way that no amount of practice at being invisible could mask. "Why?" Chandler approached the counter, grabbing a water bottle from the fridge, and the casual movement of his fingers on the transparent plastic caught her attention in an embarrassing way. "Because you work yourself to death. Someone has to care." The words came out before she could filter them, before she could remember that employees didn't say things like that to their bosses, especially not to bosses who were in a relationship with high society heiresses. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning, and when Diella finally had the courage to raise her eyes, she discovered he was much closer than he should be. So close she could feel the heat emanating from him and see the accelerated pulse in his neck above the loosened tie. It almost happened again, almost, his fingers moving as if they were going to touch her face before freezing in the air between them. The kitchen door burst open, someone from the security shift making rounds, and the moment died instantly as both stepped back like teenagers caught doing something forbidden. Diella left without looking back, but she could feel his eyes burning on her back with every step. That was all. The lie came out stronger this time, more convincing, but Chandler was too close now and saw through her with the ease of someone who had built an empire reading people like open books. Liar. The word came out almost affectionate despite the weight it carried, and he raised his hand to her face, fingers stopping centimeters from touching her skin. The second kiss would have happened right there, in the middle of the penthouse office with Manhattan witnessing through the windows. But the door opened without warning, and Phoebe Fitzgerald entered with the confidence of someone who had the right to be anywhere she wanted. Board meeting, 1 hour about the situation. The look she shot at Diella was pure ice, murderous in its silent intensity. Chandler didn't take his eyes off Diella when he responded, and there was something possessive in the way his voice came out. She stays. For security. The words fell into the space between them like stones thrown in. Still water, creating waves that would expand well beyond that moment. Chandler, this is... Phoebe began, voice sharp as broken glass. But he cut her off without ceremony. Still without looking in the direction of the girlfriend, who clearly expected more consideration. She saved me. Now protecting her is my responsibility. The word "my" echoed in the silence that followed. Loaded with implications, none of the three was ready to examine closely. Diella processed that word in slow motion, feeling the weight of it lodge somewhere close to her heart. And when she finally managed to look away from Chandler's face, she found Phoebe watching her with a complex mixture of fury, fear, and something that could be reluctant recognition. The rest of the meeting would be in an hour. But that moment in the office had already changed everything, had already shifted pieces on the complex chessboard their lives had become, and when Diella finally left there with wobbly legs and racing heart, she knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back. Chapter 3. The Sapphire Necklace Connection.
This necklace wasn't a gift.
It was a trap. A trap?
The private investigation began 12 hours after the attack, and the man Chandler hired had a resume that included 15 years at the FBI and a reputation for finding truths others preferred to keep buried. The preliminary report arrived via encrypted email at 6 in the morning, and each line Chandler read made his jaw clench tighter until his teeth ground. With enough force to hurt, it wasn't random, wasn't opportunism from some unhinged person seeking bloody fame. It was conspiracy orchestrated with surgical precision by someone who knew his movements, his schedule, even the exact layout of the event hall. Paul Trent, the name pulsed on the screen like a neon accusation, CEO of Trent Industries, and former partner Chandler, had removed from the board 3 years ago after discovering accounting fraud attempts that would have destroyed the company if they hadn't been intercepted in time. The plan was elegant in its brutality: assassinate Chandler during the most public event of the year, and then use the scandal of the kiss to destabilize the stock while the company was left without clear leadership, creating enough chaos for Paul to buy majority stake at liquidation prices and finally have the revenge he'd been cooking for years. Paranoia settled into Chandler with the force of poison entering the bloodstream, and he found himself trusting fewer and fewer people until only one remained. I trust no one. Except you. The words came out late at night when Diella entered his office, bringing coffee that hadn't been requested, but that he accepted with silent gratitude. The way her eyes widened indicated she understood the weight of what was being said, the brutal vulnerability of a man who had built walls so high that no one should be able to scale them. Chandler's penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel 30 floors above Manhattan, and when he insisted Diella stay there for safety, they both knew it was a transparent excuse to keep her close. The guest room was spacious and luxurious in a way that made her apartment seem like a shoebox. But the forced proximity created tension so thick, Diella could feel it vibrating in the air each time they crossed paths in the hallway. Breakfast became a ritual of loaded silences, him reading reports on his tablet, while she pretended interest in the morning news, but both hyper-aware of each other's every movement, every breath, every time fingers came too close reaching for the juice pitcher. The nights were worse. Doors closed, but both lying awake knowing the other was mere feet away, separated only by walls that seemed too thin to contain what was growing between them. Phoebe showed up unannounced on the third night, using the key she apparently still had, despite their relationship never having been made official in a way that would justify this kind of access. The sound of the front door opening made Diella jump from the couch where she'd been trying to read, and she reached the living room at the same moment. Phoebe invaded the space with the fury of a Category 5 hurricane seeking destruction. You destroyed everything. Phoebe's voice echoed off the glass walls, and even the stunning night view of New York seemed to pale against the intensity of her rage. He was mine, we had something, and you... The words died in a strangled sob that was part fury and part genuine pain. Diella felt something break inside her, because she recognized that pain had felt variations of it every time she saw Chandler with Phoebe at social events. Every photo of them together in gossip magazines she masochistically flipped through in supermarket checkout lines. I saved his life. The defense came out louder than intended, loaded with months of repressed feelings, finally finding voice. There was a shooter and I did what I had to do. Liar, Phoebe advanced, heels clicking on the marble floor with violent staccato. You always wanted him. I saw the way you looked, how you found excuses to be near. How the accusation was interrupted by Diella exploding in a way that surprised them both equally. Yes, I always wanted him. From the first day I saw him, the confession burst out like an explosion, like a dam breaking after holding back too much water for too long. But I would never do anything because he was with you. Because I know my place in this world and it's not beside men like Chandler. McFarland. Tears burned her eyes, but Diella refused to let them fall. Refused to give Phoebe the satisfaction of seeing her break completely. The silence that followed was heavy with truths that couldn't be undone. And then something strange happened. Something neither of them expected. Phoebe laughed. But it wasn't the sound of humor. It was bitter and broken and full of cruel irony that cut deeper than any insult could. You think he chose me? Her hands went to her neck, fingers finding the sapphire necklace she wore at almost every public appearance. This gift from Chandler. With a sharp movement that made the chain snap, Phoebe ripped off the necklace and threw it onto the glass coffee table, where it landed with a sound too loud for something so small. Paul Trent gave me this. Said it was from Chandler, that he was too shy to deliver it personally, that I should wear it as a sign of commitment. Her fingers trembled as she pointed at the jewel glittering under the indirect lights. Tracker inside. Found out yesterday. Paul knew every place I went. Every conversation I had with Chandler. Every intimate moment I thought was private. Diella felt the ground move beneath her feet, and she approached the table slowly, picking up the necklace carefully, as if it were a bomb about to explode. The weight was wrong for just stones and metal. And when she turned the piece, examining it closely, she saw the tiny device embedded in the clasp with almost imperceptible skill. You were manipulated. The words came out small, shocked, because this changed everything. Recontextualized every interaction she'd observed between Phoebe and Chandler through the poisoned lens of jealousy. Phoebe collapsed onto the white leather sofa like a marionette with cut strings, and for the first time Diella saw past the perfectly polished socialite to the frightened woman underneath. Paul said that if I didn't date Chandler, my family's investment in Trent Industries would disappear. 50 million. Money my father put in before he died. Last thing he left me besides debts that took me years to pay off. Her voice broke in a confession that carried simultaneous shame and relief. I needed that money, needed to keep up appearances, so I did what he told me. The revelation reconfigured everything Diella thought she understood about the situation, and she sat on the sofa beside Phoebe, maintaining respectful but no longer hostile distance. So you and Chandler were never really... She couldn't finish the question, but didn't need to because Phoebe understood perfectly. Obligation. The word came out bitter as bile. On his part too, I think. Investors liked seeing the CEO settled with someone appropriate, and I checked the boxes on paper. Pretty enough, rich enough, bored enough to accept crumbs of attention. Phoebe turned to face her, completely, and her eyes were red but dry. But you he sees, really sees. The way he looks at you is... It was how I dreamed someone would look at me someday. Diella felt tears. Finally escaped because this was too much. It was forgiveness where she expected. War alliance where she anticipated destruction. Do you really love him? Phoebe's question was gentle, curious, without judgment or venom, and Diella realized she was being seen for the first time too, not as a threat or competition, but as a complete person with valid feelings. Does it matter? Diella wiped the tears with the back of her hand, trying to recover composure. She'd abandoned the second she started shouting. Truths? He chose you. Even if it was obligation, even if it was convenient. She couldn't finish because it hurt too much to admit out loud. He never chose. Phoebe took her hand, gripped firm and surprisingly gentle. I was acceptable, appropriate, but you're his choice, always have been. I saw the way he fights against it. How he tries to keep his distance when he clearly wants to pull you close. She squeezed tighter. You know why this hurts less than it should. Because I finally have permission to leave. Permission to stop pretending. And because if someone's going to be with him, I'd rather it be someone who actually cares, instead of someone calculating market value. The moment could have become a reconciliatory embrace. Could have dissolved into cathartic tears of two women discovering they were allies instead of enemies. But Chandler's office door opened, and he stopped in the doorway looking like he'd aged 10 years in the last 72 hours. "Phoebe, I didn't know you were here." His voice was careful, controlled, but Diala detected tension underneath. That indicated he was prepared to intervene if the situation escalated to violence. "I was leaving." Phoebe stood with practiced grace, smoothing the dress that cost more than a used car. But first, she picked up the necklace from the table and walked to Chandler, depositing the jewel in his hand with ceremonious deliberation. "Paul Trent, tracker, he orchestrated everything. Used us?" The words came out telegraphic but carried the impact of full confession. Chandler examined the necklace, and Diala saw the exact moment comprehension hit. Him? Saw the muscles in his jaw jump when cold anger replaced confusion. How long? It was all he could ask. And Phoebe understood he wanted to know how long she'd been a piece in someone else's game. From the beginning. 18 months. The admission came out tired, defeated. "But it's over now. I'll send you all the evidence I have, emails, recordings, everything I managed to gather when I finally realized I was being used." She turned to leave but paused at the door, looking back one last time. "Diala's staying here, right? For safety." "Yes." Chandler's answer was immediate, definitive, and he didn't even try to disguise it as purely professional. Phoebe smiled, small and genuine for the first time Diala had seen, and then left, closing the door softly behind her. The silence that filled the room was different from the previous ones. It was loaded with revelations that changed everything. And when Chandler finally crossed the space to where Diala was still sitting, she saw raw vulnerability in his face he'd never shown before. 18 months living a lie. It wasn't a question it was processing out loud. "And you always knew that it wasn't real?" Diala stood to face him as an equal. "Despite the height difference, I suspected. You two never touched like people in love touch. Never looked at each other like the rest of the world disappeared. But I thought maybe that's how it worked in your world. Everything transaction and convenience." The words carried years of careful observation, of noticing details no one else saw because she was invisible, and invisibility gave unique perspective. Chandler raised the hand holding the necklace, and the light caught the sapphires, making them gleam like malicious eyes, witnessing conspiracies that had almost destroyed everything. "Paul won't stop." This was just the first move. The certainty in his voice was absolute, based on knowing his former partner too well. "We need to be prepared. Then we prepare." Diala placed her hand over his, fingers closing around the necklace along with his, and the touch sent familiar electricity racing up her arm. "Together. You said you trust me, so let me really help. Not just stay hidden here like a porcelain doll on a shelf." The almost smile, that curved his lips, was the most beautiful thing Diala had seen, and when he turned his hand to interlace fingers with hers, the sapphire necklace fell forgotten to the floor, a symbol of manipulation, finally destroyed and left behind. Chapter 4. The Mirrored Fight.
Do you have any idea what your kiss just destroyed?
The headlines began appearing like metastasis, spreading, each new story more venomous than the last. And within 48 hours, Chandler McFarlane's name had become synonymous with corporate scandal and emotional weakness. "CEO controlled by employee puts company at risk," screamed the Wall Street Journal, while Bloomberg published detailed analyses of how the kiss incident revealed leadership instability that serious investors couldn't tolerate. McFarland Industries stock plummeted 35% over 3 trading days, and each percentage point lost was $1 billion evaporating while shareholders panicked, selling positions as fast as automated systems allowed. Paul Trent had orchestrated a propaganda campaign with military precision, planting stories in strategic outlets and using contacts cultivated over years to amplify the narrative of a CEO who had lost emotional control because of a manipulative employee. Chandler spent 72 hours practically locked in the penthouse office, phone glued to his ear, negotiating with investors, demanding explanations he couldn't give without sounding even more unstable. The stress accumulated in his shoulders like physical weight, and Diala saw the transformation happening in real time, saw the man who had started opening up to her closing again behind walls of ice and brutal control. The explosion finally came on the 4th night. When Diala entered his office with coffee and a sandwich, she knew he hadn't eaten but needed, and found piles of reports scattered across the desk in chaos that contrasted violently with the meticulous order he normally maintained. 30 more employees are getting laid off tomorrow if the stock keeps falling. The words came out without him lifting his eyes, without pause in the furious typing that made the keyboard protest. It's not your fault. Diala set the tray on the only free surface she found, moving carefully around the tension that practically vibrated in the air. Paul is manipulating. She couldn't finish because Chandler stood so abruptly that the swivel chair hit the bookshelf behind him with a loud sound that made her jump. You don't understand this world. His voice thundered through the confined space, and there was something wild in his eyes she'd never seen before. Something close to desperation masked as anger. Politics, power, perception is reality here and now. Everyone sees me as an idiot who let an employee destroy an empire I spent 15 years building. Each word came out, like a projectile meant to hurt. And Diala felt the impact, even knowing it wasn't really her he was attacking. I understood when I kissed you to save you. Her response came out equally loud, equally loaded with emotions that had been cooking for days, without appropriate escape valve. I understood that sacrificing my reputation, my job, any chance at a normal life was a price worth paying to keep you alive. Tears burned her eyes, but they were from frustration, not weakness, were from months of repressing feelings now overflowing without control. Chandler crossed the office in 3 long strides. Stopping so close, Diala had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, and the heat emanating from him was almost palpable, mixed with the smell of cold, coffee and exhaustion. It was a mistake. The words came out lower but no less intense, loaded with weight that went beyond what was being said. Now everyone thinks I'm weak, that I let emotions dictate corporate decisions. That you're human? Diala interrupted him, pushing his chest with both hands, despite knowing she wouldn't move him an inch. Sorry for making people realize there's a working heart under the $5,000 suits. Sorry for revealing that a billionaire CEO bleeds red like everyone else. The irony cut sharper than any scream could, and she saw when the words hit their intended target, by the way he recoiled as if he'd been slapped. The memory invaded without permission, pulling her 3 months back to a night that seemed to belong to a completely different life. Same room, same position with her standing near the window, and him close to the desk. But the atmosphere couldn't be more opposite to the poison that now filled every inch of available air. It had been after midnight, and Diala was finishing an extra shift when she tripped over a pile of contracts someone had left in the hallway. And the sound of paper scattering had brought Chandler from the office with the expression of someone expecting to find an armed intruder. You're impossible, Chandler. Her words had come out laughing as she crouched to gather documents. And to her surprise, he had knelt to help. And you're insubordinate. Diala. His response had carried genuine humor she rarely heard, and when their fingers touched reaching for the same paper, they both froze for a second that stretched like sweet eternity. They had stayed there kneeling on the cold marble floor, smiling at each other like teenagers, sharing a secret. And the proximity was intimate without being threatening, was full of possibility instead of impossibility. He had leaned slightly, movement so subtle it could have been imagined, and his eyes had gone to her mouth with intention clear enough to make her heart race dangerously. We can't. Her words had come out whispered, half plea, half reminder, and he had agreed with a nod that seemed to cost physical effort. I know. But neither had moved for 3 more heartbeats. Neither had broken the eye contact that said everything they couldn't admit out loud. The present reasserted itself with brutal cruelty, and Diala realized she had tears running freely down her face now while Chandler watched her with a toxic mixture of anger and something dangerously close to regret. You complicated everything. His accusation came out hoarse-tired, and there was residual machismo in the words indicating stress had eroded the civilized filters he normally kept in place. The company is falling apart, investors demanding my head, and all because you couldn't stay in your place. The silence that followed was so absolute Diala could hear her own heart breaking, could feel each fragment lodging in places that would hurt for years. Then I'm sorry I saved your life. The words came out frozen, each syllable precisely articulated to cut as deep as possible. I'm sorry I cared enough to risk everything I had, which admittedly wasn't much but was mine, to keep you breathing. She turned toward the guest room that had been her temporary home, back rigidly straight despite wanting to crumble. I won't make the mistake of caring again. The suitcase she'd brought weeks ago was still in the closet, and Diella pulled it out with hands that trembled but refused to stop moving. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking completely. Clothes were thrown without care. Cosmetics swept from the dresser inside without organization. And each item she packed was a visceral reminder of a moment they'd shared in that space. Chandler appeared in the bedroom doorway, shoulder leaning against the frame in a posture that tried to look casual but failed spectacularly, given the tension visible in every line of his body. He didn't speak, just watched, while she undid weeks of shared life in 15 frantic minutes, and the heavy silence between them carried the weight of everything they couldn't say, everything they'd almost had before self-destructing, with words that couldn't be undone. The suitcase closed with a final click that sounded like a sentence, and Diella picked it up from the bed with more force than necessary, knuckles white around the handle. She had to pass him to leave, had to invade his personal space one last time, and when she stopped directly in front of him, she could feel his heat, smell of coffee and tension, and something fundamentally Chandler that had become too familiar too fast. "I always knew my place." The words came out low but firm, carrying dignity. He'd tried to take from her but failed because she'd built it, over years surviving in a world that wanted her invisible. "So you're the one who forgot yours." She maintained eye contact as she passed him, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her run or cry or beg, just walked through the marble hallways of the penthouse for the last time with her head held high and heart bleeding. The front door closed behind her with a surprisingly soft sound for something that felt like the end of everything. And only when she was safe in the elevator going down did Diella allow the sobs to finally escape. 30 floors of free fall while she cried against the cold steel wall. And when the doors opened in the lobby, she'd recomposed her mask enough to walk through without drawing undue attention. Chandler stood exactly where she'd left him for an impossible-to-measure amount of time, staring fixedly at the closed door as if force of will could make it open again. The penthouse seemed too vast now, empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture or decoration and everything to do with an absence that pulsed like an open wound. He eventually moved to the built-in bar, fingers closing around a bottle of scotch that cost more than the average monthly salary, and poured a generous dose into a crystal glass that caught the light, creating prismatic patterns he couldn't appreciate. The first sip burned going down. Welcome, because physical pain distracted from emotional, and he sank into the leather sofa, staring at the night view of Manhattan without really seeing anything. Losing the company hurt. Each percentage point of stock was a blow to the empire he'd built with sweat and blood and sacrifices no one saw because they happened. In boardrooms at 3 in the morning and conference calls that lasted until sunrise. But losing Diella, that was different, was worse, was the kind of pain scotch couldn't anesthetize, because it came from a place deeper than ambition or professional pride. The penthouse door opened without warning, and Phoebe entered with the key she'd theoretically returned, but apparently kept for emergencies. She stopped when she saw him sunk in the sofa with the bottle on the table, and the devastated expression he wasn't even trying to hide, because what was the point of pretending when everything was already destroyed anyway? "You're an idiot." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a mixture of exasperation and something that could be reluctant affection. "Thanks." Chandler poured a second dose, offered the bottle in her direction. In a silent invitation she refused with a hand gesture. "I can always count on you to state the obvious." The sarcasm came out without real force, more tired than cutting, and he took a sip long enough to make his throat protest. Phoebe sat in the opposite armchair, crossing her legs with practiced elegance, even at that absurd hour of the night. "She loves you, you love her, and yet you fought over Paul as if he deserved the power to destroy what you have." The words were brutally direct, without the filter of social courtesy she normally applied, and Chandler realized he was seeing the real version of her for the first time. "In 18 months of farce, I can't," he started to protest, to list reasons why a relationship between a billionaire CEO and a former employee who made minimum wage was impossible, impractical, destructive to both. But Phoebe cut him off with humorless laughter that had edges sharp enough to cut. "You can. You just don't want to admit that feelings are more important than the perception of idiot investors who will forget the scandal in 6 months when the next corporate gossip dominates the news cycle." She leaned forward, eyes fixed on him with an intensity that forced him to stop avoiding eye contact. Without her, you go back to being a machine, dead inside even though you're breathing. I saw it happening in real time over the last few weeks. Saw you become human again. And now you're going to throw it all away because you're scared. The words hit closer to the truth than Chandler was comfortable admitting, and he finished a third dose before responding. The company is falling apart. 300 jobs at risk. I can't put personal feelings above. The justification died because even he heard how hollow it sounded, how it was an excuse instead of a reason. Paul's going to destroy the company anyway if you let him. Phoebe stood, smoothing her dress in a gesture that was more nervousness than vanity. The difference is whether you'll fight with an ally who would give her life for you or alone because fragile male pride can't admit you need her. She walked to the door but paused with her hand on the knob. Diella isn't weak for loving you. You're weak for not having the courage to love her back publicly. The door closed, leaving Chandler alone again, and he looked at the half-empty bottle, considering finishing it alone, but finding he didn't have the stomach for more. Diella's apartment was in Queens, 30 minutes away, but might as well be another planet, given the emotional distance he'd created between them, with cruel words said under pressure that excused nothing. She was lying on the tiny couch in the studio that cost half her monthly salary, staring at the cracked ceiling that needed repair. The landlord would never do, and tears kept falling even when she thought she had no more to give. The phone had rung 17 times, messages accumulating from unknown numbers that were probably journalists, wanting statements about the scandal she'd become. But she ignored everything, because she had no energy for anything besides breathing. Chapter 5. The Cinematic Entrance.
Before you vote, you should know who owns 30% of this company.
Impossible.
The boardroom occupied the entire floor of the McFarland Industries building, and the panoramic windows offered a view that should inspire confidence, but today only served as a brutal reminder of how far it was possible to fall. 15 board members sat around the mahogany table that cost more than a suburban house, and each face carried an expression ranging from genuine concern to poorly disguised satisfaction, depending on how much Paul Trent had paid for their loyalty. Chandler sat at the head where he'd presided for 7 years since becoming CEO, after the founder's death, but today the chair felt like an unstable throne about to be yanked out from under him by hands he'd trusted and that now betrayed him with polite smiles and manufactured concerns about fiduciary responsibility. The stock had dropped another 6 percentage points since yesterday, 41% total loss in 1 week. And numbers didn't lie even when the people around the table did exactly that. Paul Trent was at the other end of the table like a coiled snake, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the smile curving his lips was barely contained triumph of a man who had spent 3 years planning revenge and finally saw his plan coming to fruition. Gentlemen, lady, he began with false deference that made Chandler's stomach turn. We're here to discuss a crisis that threatens not just our profitability, but the very existence of this company we all love. The numbers were projected on the screen behind him with brutal efficiency, red graphs showing the stock plunge, catastrophic projections of future losses. If the trend continued, investor sentiment analysis that painted Chandler as an emotionally compromised leader who had allowed a personal scandal to destroy decades of built corporate reputation. 41% loss in 7 days. Paul let the number hang in the air like a death sentence. Institutional investors withdrawing billions. Clients questioning long-term contracts. All because our CEO lost emotional control. Chandler felt rage boiling beneath the controlled surface he maintained with effort that made his jaw muscles ache. But he knew exploding now would only prove Paul's point. Only confirm the narrative of an unstable man incapable of separating personal from professional. The crisis was manufactured. His voice came out calm despite the internal hurricane. By someone in this room who orchestrated an assassination attempt when manipulation wasn't enough to get what he wanted. The silence that followed was heavy with shock or pretense of shock, depending on how much each board member knew about Paul's involvement. And then someone from the conservative wing spoke up with a voice that trembled between genuine concern and calculated opportunism. With all due respect, Mr. McFarland, these are serious accusations that require evidence. And at the moment, all we have are numbers showing the company is in free fall. Under your leadership. Paul seized the opening like the predator he was, advancing with a motion he'd prepared with the assistance of lawyers who cost $1,000 an hour. I propose immediate voting for the removal of Chandler McFarland as CEO, effective immediately, with the board chairman assuming an interim role until we can find stable leadership that puts the company's interests above. He paused with the perfect timing of a rehearsed actor. Inappropriate personal entanglements. The vote was about to begin when Chandler stood, palms pressed against the cold mahogany surface, with enough force to make his fingers turn white. I built this company. The words came out low but loaded with intensity that made some members instinctively recoil, transformed a failing regional operation into a global technology leader. Every innovation, every strategic acquisition, every decision that brought us here was mine. And now you want to remove me because of the double mahogany doors at the end of the room opened, and time literally seemed to decelerate in a way that Chandler later wouldn't be sure was real, or if his mind had processed the moment in cinematic slow motion. Diella entered, but this wasn't the Diella in a black uniform, who moved invisible between tables, serving champagne. Wasn't the Diella in faded jeans and a simple t-shirt he'd seen at her apartment. This Diella wore a grey Armani suit that molded to her body with custom-tailored precision that cost months of her salary, and the cut was powerful without being masculine, was a statement from someone who belonged in rooms like this, even though the entire world had tried to convince her otherwise for years. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant bun that exposed the line of her neck and angle of her jaw, and the heels she wore added 4 inches, making her seem taller, more imposing, more impossible to ignore. She moved with confidence Chandler had never seen in her before, but realized had always been there underneath, waiting for permission to emerge. And there was something like a mental soundtrack playing only in her head, something epic and triumphant that matched the beat of her heart that he could swear he could hear across the distance between them. Every eye in the room turned to follow her as she walked with measured and deliberate steps around the table, and the silence was so complete that the sound of heels on marble echoed like drum beats marking an execution. Paul was first to recover his voice, and there was a note of panic beginning to bleed through his earlier confidence. "Security, please remove this." He couldn't finish because Diella finally spoke, and her voice carried no hesitation or subordination she'd learned to use as armor in years of invisibility. "I have voting rights." 4 words that fell like bombs in the middle of the boardroom, and she placed a leather folder on the table with a sound that was part deliberate slam and part declaration of war. "As majority shareholder of this company, I have not just the right but the obligation to participate in this vote." The silence that followed was so absolute, it would be possible to hear a pin drop 3 floors below. "Rights? You're a fired employee who—" Paul began to protest with his voice rising in volume as perception of control slipped through his fingers like sand. But Diella interrupted him by opening the folder and spreading documents across the table with the efficiency of a lawyer presenting a case in court. "Heiress, 30% of this company's shares, to be precise." She let the revelation hang while picking up an authenticated copy of the will that had arrived via registered mail 3 days ago with timing. That couldn't be more perfect if it had been orchestrated by a Hollywood screenwriter. "Robert Brown left me his shares in a will that was only processed last week, due to legal complications with his estate." Her fingers traced the name on the document, and her voice carried real emotion for the first time. "I took care of him in the last 6 months of his life. I was the only person who visited him in the hospital when no one else cared." Chandler felt like the floor had been yanked out from under him. But unlike when Paul presented devastating numbers, this was shock that came with a spark of desperate hope. "Diella," her name came out hoarse, broken, loaded with everything they hadn't said the last time they'd seen each other. But she still didn't look in his direction, maintaining laser focus on Paul like a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "Robert told me stories," Diella continued as she walked slowly around the table, making each board. Member flinched slightly when she passed close Morris, about how he founded this company, with a dream of creating technology that would change lives. "He told me about a partner he admitted years ago, a brilliant but morally flexible young man who tried to divert funds to an offshore account and almost destroyed everything they'd built." She stopped directly behind Paul's chair, hands resting on the leather back in a gesture that was part threat and part promise. "He told me about Chandler McFarland, who discovered the fraud and had the courage to expose it. even knowing it would destroy a friendship. The next documents were spread across the table with surgical precision, and each page was a condemnation Paul had thought was buried deeply enough to never resurface. Emails exchanged with the hired shooter, bank transfers tracing payment, recordings of conversations where the conspiracy was planned, with details that made even the most corrupt board members pale imagining legal implications. "It took me 3 days compiling all this," Diella explained, with the tone of a teacher patiently educating slow students, "with help from a private investigator who's apparently very good at finding truths people prefer to keep hidden." Paul tried to stand but found his legs, wouldn't obey commands, and his face had lost all color, becoming a wax mask, sweating profusely despite the air conditioning keeping the room at perfectly controlled temperature. "This is a setup! Fabricated evidence by a desperate woman trying to—" The protests died when the door opened again and Phoebe Fitzgerald entered, with timing that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. "Proof of blackmail," Phoebe announced, placing her own folder beside Diela's in a gesture of solidarity that made something tighten in Chandler's chest. "Documenting 18 months of manipulation, where I was forced into a fake relationship to protect my family's investment. Recordings, emails, even photographs of secret meetings where Paul coordinated every move." She finally looked at Chandler with an expression that asked forgiveness for things that weren't her fault. "I'm formally withdrawing all Fitzgerald investment from this company, effective immediately, permanently." The board erupted into silent pandemonium, urgent whispers being exchanged between members who recalculated loyalties as they realized the train they'd bet on was spectacularly derailing. Chandler was still processing the revelation that Diella owned 30% of his company, that she had voting power that made her opinion more important than most people in that room when she finally turned to face him completely. "My vote," Diella said, with a voice that carried unshakable certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why, "is for Chandler McFarland to remain as CEO of this company he built with blood, and sacrifice no one here had the courage to match." She maintained eye contact with him across the length of the room, and the rest of the world seemed to blur at the edges until there existed only the two of them connected by a gaze that said everything words couldn't. "And as majority shareholder, I demand a full investigation of Paul Trent and his immediate removal from any position of influence in this organization." The vote that followed was a formality, because numbers didn't lie, and Diella alone controlled enough stake to make her opinion law. But each board member who raised a hand in favor of keeping Chandler was a vote of confidence he knew he'd have to earn back with hard work and concrete results. Paul was escorted out by corporate security, who'd already received advance instructions, and the last sight they had of him was the hunched back of a man who had lost everything betting on revenge that blew up in his face. The room gradually emptied as board members left murmuring among themselves about the dramatic turn no one had predicted, and eventually only Chandler and Diella remained separated by 30 feet of polished mahogany table and a week of cruel words that couldn't be erased but perhaps could be forgiven. Phoebe had left discreetly after shaking Diella's hand in a gesture of mutual respect between women who had discovered they were allies instead of enemies. Chandler was first to break the silence that had stretched to the point of discomfort, pushing his chair back and standing with movements that seemed older than they should for a 35-year-old man. 30%, he repeated as if testing the reality of the words. "And you never mentioned it. Not once in all the conversations we had." It wasn't an accusation. It was genuine confusion from someone who thought he knew someone and discovered there were entire hidden layers. "I found out 3 days ago when the lawyer finally managed to process the will through the legal bureaucracy that delayed everything for months." Diella didn't move from where she stood at the other end of the room, maintaining distance that could be professional or self-preservation or both. "Robert died 7 months ago, but the estate was complicated, and no one knew he'd included me until the paperwork showed up." Her fingers traced the edge of the table absently. "I could have sold the shares, taken the money and disappeared into a completely different life, far from all this. Why didn't you sell?" The question came out more vulnerable than Chandler intended, loaded with fear of an answer he didn't want to hear. But he needed to know, needed to understand what had brought her back when he'd given her every reason to simply cut her losses and move on. Diella finally moved, walking around the table with measured steps until she was close enough for him to see the reflection of the ceiling lights in her eyes, but still not touching, still maintaining the last vestige of professional distance they both knew was false, because you're a stubborn idiot who works himself to death, building things that matter, and letting Paul destroy everything you created would be a betrayal of everything Robert believed in when he left the company in your hands 7 years ago. Her voice softened at the end. And because I love you, despite everything, despite the horrible things we said, despite you pushing me away when you should have pulled me close. Chapter 6. The Real Kiss. The hallway outside the boardroom was all Italian marble and heavy silence, and Diella had managed exactly 5 steps before hearing the door open behind her with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the empty space. "Diella!" Chandler's voice cut across the distance between them. Urgent and loaded with emotion, he was no longer trying to hide, and she stopped, with her hand frozen in the air reaching for the elevator button. She didn't turn immediately because she knew seeing his face would destroy the last line of defense she'd built in the last hours, preparing for that moment. So she stood staring at the polished steel elevator doors while listening to his footsteps approaching until she could feel his presence burning against her back, even without physical contact. The shares. You never said. Repetition of the earlier statement, but this time carrying hurt. Instead of confusion, as if the betrayal of silence was worse than any lie could be. I found out yesterday, when the lawyer finally managed to locate all the documents necessary for the official transfer. Diella still didn't turn, still kept her eyes fixed on her own distorted reflection in the elevator doors, where she could see the silhouette behind her like a protective and threatening shadow at the same time. The will was held up in probate due to technical complications no one could resolve until now. And when the paperwork showed up, it was as much of a shock as it's being for you. Her breath came out shaky despite her effort to keep it controlled. Robert never mentioned it, never hinted, just treated me like a human being when I visited him, and apparently that was worth 30% of a lifetime's legacy. The silence that followed was filled only with the sound of their mismatched breathing and the distant hum of air conditioning maintaining perfect temperature that did nothing to cool the heat growing between them. "Why did you help?" Chandler's question came out hoarse, broken at the edges. "After how I treated you, after the things I said, you had every right to let Paul destroy me and sell the shares to the highest bidder." Heavy pause. "But you came back. Why?" Diella finally turned, a slow movement that was part reluctance and part inevitable surrender. And when her eyes met his across the meter of distance that felt like miles, she saw raw vulnerability he'd never allowed anyone to witness. "Because I love you." 3 words that came out simple but carried the weight of months repressing feelings that grew in shared silences and almost kisses that never happened until one finally did and changed everything. Despite your arrogance, despite your impossible pride, despite you being a complete idiot when you're under pressure, tears burned. But she didn't let them fall because crying now would be admitting weakness. She didn't feel, "I've loved you since the first time I had the courage to confront you about working yourself to collapse, and every day since then only made it worse." Chandler closed the distance in a movement that was contained explosion, without cinematic slow motion or calculated hesitation, just raw need manifesting in action. His hands found her face with urgency, bordering on desperation, and the kiss was a collision of everything they'd repressed for too long, was fast and intense and loaded with months of wanting, without being able to have. His lips were demanding against hers, and Diella responded with equal ferocity, fingers gripping the lapels of his suit, with enough force to wrinkle the expensive fabric. They lasted perhaps 10 seconds before the need for oxygen forced them to separate, panting and dazed, and Chandler rested his forehead against hers while they both tried to recover the capacity for coherent thought. Again, his voice came out a hoarse command, but slow this time. "I want to remember every second." The hands that had been gripping her face loosened to a gentler touch, thumbs tracing the line of her jaw with reverence that contrasted violently with the earlier urgency. The second kiss was cinematic in its deliberate slowness, was exploration instead of conquest. Was Chandler savoring every nuance, like a man who'd been in the desert and finally found water. Time seemed to decelerate until Diella could count his heartbeats against the palm pressed to his chest, could feel the fine tremor running through his muscles as evidence of how much control it cost to maintain the measured pace. The world around them literally stopped existing. Manhattan disappeared beyond the windows, and only the two of them remained. Suspended in a bubble of perfect moment neither wanted to end. When they finally separated, it was gradual, reluctant, as if pulling away caused physical pain that both felt but accepted as necessary. "I love you." Chandler's words came out firm for the first time, without hesitation or qualification. "Since the first time you confronted me in the hospital, and stayed when no one else cared enough, since every coffee you brought without asking, since watching you care for Robert with kindness he didn't receive from his own family." His fingers still traced her face as if memorizing topography. "I only want you, no one else. Never again." "And Phoebe?" The question came out small because she needed to confirm that the ghost of the previous relationship wouldn't haunt what they were trying to build. But Chandler smiled for the first time since the board meeting, and the expression completely transformed his face. Free to live her own life without the weight of expectations neither of us wanted to carry. He kissed her forehead gently, a gesture that was more promise than passion. "She deserves someone who loves her the way I love you. And I deserve to stop fighting the only real feeling I've had in years." He pulled Diella against his chest in an embrace that finally allowed her to crumble slightly, allowed the tension of the last week to drain while he held the pieces. No hiding, no shame. Public and proud or it doesn't happen. 3 months later, the annual McFarland Industries Gala took place in the same crystal ballroom where it had all begun. But the atmosphere couldn't be more different from the chaos that had been the last time. The stock had fully recovered and then risen another 20% as investors realized that a company under Chandler's stable leadership with Diella as majority shareholder was a safer bet than any other in the tech market. Diella wasn't wearing a black uniform this time, wasn't carrying a champagne tray or moving invisible between tables. The midnight blue dress she wore had been custom made by a designer who normally only served royalty, and the cut emphasized her curves in a way that made Chandler have to constantly remind himself to maintain expressions appropriate for a corporate event. She was at his side as an equal, as a partner in both business and life, and his hand at her waist was a public declaration that challenged anyone to comment. "Afraid of scandal," Diella murmured low enough for only him to hear as they posed for photographers capturing every angle of the couple who had become a fascination of corporate media in recent months. The story of the invisible employee who saved a CEO and then revealed herself as an heiress had been told and retold until it became a modern Cinderella legend for the tech era. "With you?" Chandler turned his head enough for his lips to brush her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. "I'll bring scandal on purpose just to have an excuse to defend you." They kissed right there in the middle of the ballroom with 200 witnesses and dozens of cameras capturing the moment. But this time it was celebration. Instead of shock was approval instead of horror. And the flashes that exploded around them were documentation of love they no longer feared to show. A week later, Diella sat on the exam table staring at the ceiling while the doctor moved the ultrasound over her abdomen with cold gel that made her flinch slightly. Pregnant. The word came out as confirmation of suspicion that had grown in recent weeks as symptoms accumulated in ways she could no longer ignore. 8 weeks if calculations are correct. "Congratulations." The doctor smiled with genuine warmth while wiping off the gel and handing over a printed copy of the first image, showing a blurred spot that would be a person in a few months. Shock gave way to happiness so intense that Diella had to blink tears to clear. Her vision enough to drive back to the penthouse where Chandler was working on a presentation for Japanese investors. She entered his office without knocking, because she had privileges now that included interrupting meetings when necessary, and the way he looked up with the automatic smile he reserved only for her made her heart race even after 3 months together. "We need to talk." Words that normally preceded bad news, but her tone was wrong, for tragedy. And Chandler immediately realized something had changed. Closed his laptop with a definitive click, giving complete attention. Diella placed the ultrasound image on the desk between them, grainy black and white, that didn't look like much to the untrained eye. But the meaning was clear enough. Chandler stayed completely still for 3 heartbeats that Diella counted, because she was paying attention to every detail of his reaction. And then the smile that lit up his face was more genuine than any expression she'd witnessed in months of careful observation. Marriage. It wasn't a question, it was a declaration, was a plan forming in real time. 3 months. Enough time to plan something small but meaningful. I'm going to get married. Pregnant? Diella tried to sound scandalized but couldn't hide her own smile that mirrored his. And when he circled the desk to pull her into an embrace that was part celebration and part instinctive protection of something precious, she melted against his chest. We're getting married, happy. His correction came murmured against her hair. Everything else is just details that don't matter compared to this. 3 months later, the garden Chandler had rented on a private property outside the city was decorated with elegant simplicity that Diella had insisted on because crowds still made her nervous, even after months under the public spotlight. Only 50 guests, people who truly mattered instead of social obligations that would have inflated the list to hundreds. And the late afternoon sun created golden light that the photographer captured, with the skill of an artist documenting a masterpiece. The dress Diella wore had been altered 3 times, as her small but growing belly required adjustments, and the silk fabric flowed over her curves in a way that was elegant without completely hiding evidence of the life growing inside her. Chandler couldn't stop looking, as if afraid she'd disappear if he diverted his attention for a second, and when she finally walked the improvised aisle between white chairs with her hand on Phoebe's arm, who had insisted on giving her away as a gift of the unlikely friendship they'd formed, he felt his throat tighten with emotion. He didn't try to hide. His vows were written and rewritten a dozen times until he finally accepted that words would never completely capture what he felt. But when the moment came and he held her hands between his larger ones, looking into her eyes with intensity that made the rest of the world disappear, the words came naturally. You saved me, twice. His voice came out firm despite tears that gleamed but didn't fall. First time when you kissed to stop the bullet that would have ended everything. Second, when you refused to give up on me, even when I gave you every reason to run. He squeezed her hands tighter. I promised to spend the rest of my life deserving the choice you made, deserving the love you offer so freely, when I fought so hard to accept it. Diella's vows were simpler, but no less powerful. Were truth distilled into sentences she'd practiced in the mirror until they, sounded right. You saw me. When I was invisible to the entire world, when I'd accepted, I would always be a shadow serving more important people. You looked and really saw. Her voice broke slightly, but she continued, because this mattered, because he deserved to hear it. Now we're visible together, and I promise never to let you forget that being seen, being known completely and loved anyway, is the rarest gift that exists. The kiss that sealed the vows was witnessed by applause and some emotional sobs from guests who had followed their saga through headlines and gossip, but now saw a happy ending unfolding in real time. Chandler held her face with reverence that had become familiar, but never lost its impact, and when their lips met, it was promise and celebration, and the beginning of everything they would build together. The reception was intimate and joyful, and when the sun finally set and stars emerged in a sky without the city's light, pollution, Chandler and Diella danced on the lawn under fairy lights that had been hung in ancient trees, and she rested her head against his shoulder, feeling peace she'd never imagined possible for a girl who grew up believing happiness was for other people. No regrets? His question was murmured against the top of her head, and she felt the vibration of the words through his chest pressed against her. None. The answer came immediate and completely honest. You? Diella pulled back enough to see his face, to confirm the expression matched the words. Just one, Chandler admitted, and she felt a moment of panic before he continued, with the smile that was all mischief, that it took me so long to have the courage to kiss you. We could have had 6 extra months if I hadn't been a stubborn idiot. He spun, her in a movement that made the dress swirl and drew laughter from her that echoed through the garden like its own music. 9 months transformed into years that became a decade, and the story of the invisible employee who kissed the CEO and saved his life became legend told in business schools as an example of courage under pressure. But for Chandler and Diella, it was simply how everything began, the moment that changed trajectories and proved that sometimes desperate acts of love were exactly what was needed to save not just lives but souls too.
Kay's reflection. There are stories that touch us through the grandeur of their settings, and there are those that transform us through the brutal truth they carry about what it means to be human in a world that teaches us to be machines. The kiss that saved his life is the second category, disguised as a corporate romance, but revealing itself as a profound meditation on invisibility, courage, and the price we pay for allowing fear to govern our most important choices. At the heart of this narrative pulses a question we all face, but few have the courage to examine. How many times do we make ourselves invisible by our own choice, accepting the role of supporting character in a life that should be led by ourselves? Diella Martin spent 3 years serving champagne to people who never looked at her face, and that invisibility wasn't just imposed by a cruel class system, but fed by an internalized belief that her place was in the shadows. The true revolution didn't happen when she kissed Chandler to save him from the shooter, but when she finally accepted that she deserved to be seen, that her voice had the right to occupy space in rooms where she'd previously only served silently. Chandler McFarland represents another type of equally devastating prison, that of a man who built a fortress so impenetrable around his vulnerabilities that he ended up imprisoning his own humanity inside it. His relationship with Phoebe was a symptom of a larger disease, the conviction that true love was a luxury a billionaire CEO couldn't afford when there was an empire to protect and appearances to maintain. He had everything society defines as success: unlimited power, wealth beyond any practical need, respect from peers and envy from competitors, and yet he was fundamentally alone in a way money could never remedy. The conspiracy orchestrated by Paul Trent serves as a dark mirror, showing what happens when we allow resentment to rot without confrontation. 3 years planning revenge, 3 years allowing a bruised ego's wound to transform into destructive obsession that almost destroyed not just Chandler but dozens of lives connected to the company. It's a brutal reminder of the damage we cause when we choose vengeance over healing, when we feed hatred instead of processing rejection and moving forward with dignity and tact. But perhaps the most powerful reflection in this story lies in Phoebe Fitzgerald's journey. A woman everyone presumed to be the villain when she was actually a victim, equally trapped in cruel manipulation. Her transformation from apparent antagonist to unexpected ally illustrates a truth we rarely admit. People who seem to have everything, beauty, wealth, access to elite circles, can be imprisoned in gilded cages as restrictive as any material poverty. She accepted a loveless relationship because she needed the investment, sold her emotional autonomy for financial security, and when she finally had the courage to free herself, she discovered that the loss of what she never really had was a small price compared to the gain of authentic freedom. The kiss that starts everything isn't just a physical act of saving a life. It's a perfect metaphor for the courage it takes to admit true feelings in a world that punishes vulnerability. Diella had 2 seconds to act and chose a method that would expose her completely, that would destroy the safe anonymity she'd cultivated, that would place her under spotlights she'd spent years avoiding. And in that impossible choice made under unimaginable pressure, she didn't just save Chandler's body, but also his soul, forcing him to confront feelings he'd repressed for months, because they were inconvenient to the narrative he'd built about who he should be. The true victory of this story doesn't happen in the boardroom when Diella reveals her inherited shares and defeats Paul's conspiracy. It happens in smaller, more intimate moments, when Chandler finally admits he needs her instead of pretending self-sufficiency, when Diella stops apologizing for taking up space and accepts she deserves a seat at the table, when Phoebe chooses authenticity over appearances, even knowing it will cost access to a world that had defined her identity for years. In the end, the kiss that saved his life teaches us that true courage is rarely spectacular heroism filmed by cameras. It's the daily decision to be vulnerable when armor seems safer, to choose love when convenience would be easier, to risk rejection when acceptance of crumbs is available. It's Diella deciding to kiss the man she loves even knowing it could destroy her. It's Chandler admitting that billions don't replace genuine human connection. It's Phoebe choosing freedom over financial security. And perhaps the most important lesson, sometimes being seen, truly seen by someone who chooses to love us despite all our imperfections, is the deepest salvation that exists. Chandler was saved from a bullet, but more importantly, he was saved from a life lived behind masks. Diella was saved from self-imposed invisibility. Both were saved from versions of themselves the world wanted them to be, finally free to become who they always should have been. This is a story about a kiss that saved a life, but more deeply, it's about having the courage to truly live instead of just safely survive. And if you want to check out another story, click on the video appearing on your screen now.